Welcome to the second segment of When Two or Three Are Gathered Together. This course is looking at the formation of the Book of Common Prayer. This section looks at the reigns of Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth I of England, and it's during this time that we can truly say the Church of England was born. Mary and Elizabeth Tudor were half-sisters, their father of course Henry VIII of England. Before them, their younger brother Edward VI had reigned, but he had died in 1533. It's likely that if Henry had had his choice, he would have chosen the much more politically savvy Elizabeth to be Queen of England. But as it was, the Catholic Mary took the throne upon her brother's death. Mary Tudor was the oldest of Henry VIII's children, as we have seen, born in 1516. After Edward VI's death in 1533, she took no time in coming to London with an army to claim her throne. The following year, in 1534, she was married to Philip II of Spain. This was as much a political alliance as anything else. Spain was the great threat to England in Europe, and England did not have enough money to risk a war with Spain. Spain was also Catholic, as was Mary, and the Church in England was realigned with Rome, so the Pope once again became the head of the Church in England. This was not only political. Mary was personally fervent in her faith, and she persecuted Protestants heavily. During her reign, there were over 300 executions on religious grounds, including some very high-profile figures. She died in 1558, probably of stomach cancer, although at the time she thought she may be pregnant after a long wait for a child. As we've seen, there were both winners and losers during Mary's reign. The losers were the Protestants. The three most famous probably were Bishops Kramer, Latimer and Ridley, who were all burned at the stake in Oxford. The spot still exists today here, and there is Martyrs Memorial just around the corner, which exists to commemorate them and their sacrifice. Kramer, of course, the very man who we have just seen writing the first two editions of the Book of Common Prayer. The winners, of course, were those Catholics who had been in exile and now came back from Europe. The church was restored to a Catholic church, which was of course relatively easy, because the system and structure was still in place. England was back under the authority of the Pope. For many people in the pews, this was a relief. Many of them had never understood why all this arguing was going on, and they just wanted a religion they could understand and were familiar with. Mary's reign was hardly a time of peace in England. Many Protestants left and were exiled in Europe. The unexpected effect this had was that people like John Knox were further radicalized into Protestantism. The church they left was much more moderate than the church they encountered on the continent. The country remained divided, many spending their time plotting how to get Elizabeth back on the throne. When Elizabeth did come to the throne after her sister's death, she had to quickly re-establish authority over the church in England and cut all ties with the Pope again. She also needed to have a consensus in England because there were too many factions looking for power. Elizabeth I was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, one of the wives who Henry VIII had had executed. She was only 20 when Mary came to the throne, but she spent a year in the Tower and a year under house arrest. She became the focus of anti-Catholic sentiment in the country after Mary married Prince Philip of Spain, a political as well as religious and emotional alliance. Elizabeth was viewed by many Catholics as illegitimate. Henry had divorced his wife Catherine and then married her mother, and this divorce was never sanctioned by the Pope, and therefore any children after that first marriage were illegitimate. When it was believed that Mary was pregnant, Elizabeth was recalled to London to be with her sister. but it turned out that it was not a pregnancy, but probably stomach cancer. And so in 1558, after Mary's death, Elizabeth became Queen of England. Elizabeth has to paint a very careful picture of herself. This is an address she gave to Parliament. "My lords, the law of nature moves me to sorrow for my sister. The burden that is fallen upon me makes me amazed, and yet, considering that I am God's creature, ordained to obey his appointment, I will thereto yield, desiring from the bottom of my heart that I may have the assistance of his grace, to be the minister of his heavenly will in this office now committed to me. And as I am but one body naturally considered, though by his permission a body politic to govern, so shall I desire you all to be assistant to me, that I with my ruling, and you with your service, may make a good account to Almighty God, and leave some comfort to our posterity on earth. I mean to direct all my actions by good advice and counsel." So she very much places herself in her office as monarch. She places herself under God, but takes her full authority as Queen of England. But she asks for help. She understands that she needs people to see her as valuing their opinions. As she comes to the throne, getting the church in England under control and under her authority is one of the most crucial things Elizabeth has to establish. She has to move quickly. There are too many factions competing for power for her not to. She has 2 prayer books to choose from, one from 1549 and one from 1552. If you watch the first segment of this course, you'll remember that the 1549 book is very much based on the old Catholic liturgy. The 1552 book has much more Protestant and Calvinist influence. Somehow she has to try to please everyone in this decision, something which is not going to be possible. However, in 1559, there are many bishoprics in England empty after Mary's reign, which means that she had a choice of legislation which she may not have had a few years prior, and certainly would not have a few years later. Many believe that her personal preference was the 1549 book, but for the sake of unity and uniformity, she chose the 1552 book as the basis for the 1559 Book of Common Prayer, and passed a new Act of Uniformity requiring its use in England. As we said, many scholars believe that if Elizabeth had not been in such a precarious political position, she would simply have reissued the 1549 prayer book. It was closer to the beliefs she grew up with, and much closer to anything she would have heard from her father. She herself seems to have stuck to many of the older Catholic practices, with Catholic symbols like the Virgin Mary in her private chapel. The chapel royal musicians, those musicians who played in the royal palaces, composed music with the 1549 words and not the 1552 ones. So although publicly she used the 1552 book, it seems that privately she was much more aligned with the old Catholic practices. The Via Media means the middle road or the middle way. Elizabeth had to walk a very careful path between the powerful factions of the Roman Catholics and the extreme Protestants. Like her father, she believed that she and not the Pope should be head of the church. However, she used the phrase supreme governor. She was a woman and could not be a priest, and so she was very political in her use of words. Like her father, she did not like preaching. She called it prophesying, and so like him, she issued a book of homilies. These are expected to be used by all preachers on Sunday. It's very far from our concept of a sermon. Clergy would be required to read one of these homilies, not to make something up. Elizabeth stood firm on her choice of the 1559 Book of Common Prayer. It simply was not a point of conversation which she would allow. The tensions from either side never really went away, but by holding firm, by placing a stick firmly in the ground, she anchored England, at least during her reign. The lead bishop in England is the Archbishop of Canterbury. There were 3 archbishops during Elizabeth's reign, which was relatively stable for the time. The first of Elizabeth's archbishops was Matthew Parker. He became Archbishop of Canterbury in 1559. He was really a librarian, collecting a great library of texts in order to compose a unified history of England. He himself translated Anglo-Saxon English into Tudor English, and his scholarship has contributed hugely to the historical study of life in England over the ages. The criticism of him would be that he maintained editorial prerogative over his translations and sometimes interposed his own personal views onto them. The next 3 slides have versions of the Lord's Prayer, just so you can see how much English changed over a few hundred years. This is Anglo-Saxon English, so from the 10th or 11th century. It's almost unrecognizable. Only because you know it's the text of the Lord's Prayer can you maybe pick out a few words here and there. And this is Middle English, so this is from the 14th century or thereabouts. This is the language of Julian of Norwich or of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Again, you can recognize words, and probably more words than you could have done before, but were they out of context, you may have trouble except for an odd word here and there. This is the version of the Lord's Prayer with which most people are familiar. It's important to remember though, this is Tudor English. Were you to be given another text from the same period in this sort of English, you may have more trouble understanding it. This is the English of Shakespeare, not of the modern world. Matthew Parker did not feel any of his actions in editing and adding commentary to the history of England were unjustified. He said once, "We're born not only for ourselves, but for country, parents, and friends." He saw a commonality between people. He realized he was performing a high-stakes task, informing the identity of a nation, and he had to inform that identity towards the place in which he was and where Elizabeth was reigning. History, he saw, was for the benefit of all, and he saw his actions as overcoming years of Catholic neglect and deprecations. So it was a sense of passion that he started to form a single unified trajectory for the history of England. This caused in itself the establishment of nation and the establishment of national identity and a national church justified his actions in his own mind. Edmund Grindal was Archbishop of Canterbury from 1575 to 1573. Like the other archbishops of this age, he had to walk a careful middle line between the extreme Protestants and the Catholics, and he was careful by nature. So when Elizabeth was disturbed by reports of prophesying in some outlying communities, that is, people who were interpreting the Bible for themselves and preaching without her book of homilies, she was furious. Grindal had in fact already launched an investigation, but he found himself arrested because Elizabeth felt he had not acted fast enough and thereby had aided and abetted this illegal behavior. There was so much factionalism and so much suspicion around that Grindal had pretty near an impossible task, but his cautious nature made it much worse for him. He is the only Archbishop of Canterbury to have died from natural causes under arrest. John Whitgift was Archbishop of Canterbury for 21 years between 1583 and 1604. He's often credited with beginning the High Church movement. This may or may not be true. Whitgift himself was not a high churchman. Well, we don't think he was. He actually trod a careful path between the Calvinists and the high churchmen. However, he did sponsor some high church chaplains to the royal court. It was a risky enterprise, but he got away with it, which is why he is often seen as the beginning of a new movement within the Church of England. This is Lancelot Andrews, and he is one of Whitgift's chaplains. He is another cautious person, because expressing views that were too far one way or the other would be very dangerous. Some called these chaplains Lutherans, because that actually is higher church than Calvinists, and they definitely were not Calvinists, but perhaps they're more proto-Arminians, and the Arminians will come later in Charles's reign. As Elizabeth ages, it's obvious that she's not going to go on forever, and so plotting and positioning starts as to what will come next. The monarch will change, so people want to be in powerful political positions and have good subordinates in order to make it through the transition. So right now, all of these people, Whitgift and Andrews and others, are treading a publicly middle road, but later on, as James and Charles take the throne, their true views will become more important. One of Elizabeth's greatest achievements was that the religious settlement she had come to in 1559 held for the rest of her reign. Without people killing each other for religious reasons, they could focus their energy on rebuilding England as a great political power. All those parties were still there, and they were all vying for the ear of the crown, but the crown never moved. She insisted on staying where she had been in 1559. England is a bizarre anomaly in the Reformation. Many people call the Church of England Reformed yet Catholic. It certainly never underwent the rigours of the continental catechesis, that continental teaching of reform, change and Protestantism. Because the monarch was the head of the church, it never underwent the political turmoil of reformed churches taking over politics. The 39 articles, which are in the back of the Book of Common Prayer, form the basis for a strangely English form of Protestantism, but also the prayer book left enough space that later monarchs could add only a few words and turn it into a book which was more Catholic again. Elizabeth's always careful around religion, but as I said, she will never budge from 1559, and she would move heavily against anyone who tried to go too far from the central line which she maintained. Elizabeth understood that simply writing laws and changing a prayer book would not always change people's opinions. I never had any meaning or intent, she says, that my subjects should be troubled or molested by examination or inquisition in any matter either of their faith or, for that matter, of ceremonies, as long as they shall in their outward confession show themselves quiet and not manifestly repugnant to the laws of the realm. Remember, the Book of Common Prayer and its use was regulated by an act of uniformity. It was required that it was used in every church in the nation. It seems like Elizabeth really didn't mind very much what people did behind closed doors and in the privacy of their own homes, but publicly, any rejection of the Book of Common Prayer involved a rejection of the crown, and that she would not tolerate. It seems like Elizabeth was a very devout Christian. She certainly prayed in her private chapel, and this is a note from one of her advisors. Truly religious, who every day, as soon as she arose, spent some time in prayers to God, and afterwards also at set times in her private chapel. Every Sunday and holy day she went into her chapel. Neither was there ever any other prince present at God's service with greater devotion. The sermons in Lent attentively she heard, being all in black, after the manner of old, although she many times said that she had rather talk with God devoutly by prayer than hear others speak eloquently of God. So this was a fan of hers, of course, but it seems even in her own practice that she held that old and new of English religion, the old of tradition and the new of personal contact with God. Elizabeth once said, "There is but one God, one Jesus Christ. All else is dispute over trifles." If we learn nothing else from her, we might want to remember this sentence, because it speaks as powerfully to the church in this age as it did to the church in her own.